anything he gives you.
The Glass and the Girl extended cut. The restaurant smelled like scorched garlic and old money. Crystal caught the light from a chandelier the size of a small car, and somewhere beneath the murmur of 40 conversations, a string quartet worked through something nobody was actually listening to. Suo Yang sat at the corner table reserved permanently in his name, the one with a clear line to both exits, and across from him, Min-jae was laughing at his own joke before he'd finished telling it. A waiter set a single glass of wine in front of Suo Yang. Deep red, the kind that cost more than the waiter made in a week. Min-jae lifted his own glass first, to finally ending the war. Suo Yang studied him for a moment before he reached for the glass. 11 years they'd known each other. 11 years of watching this man's face do exactly what it was supposed to do, laugh when laughter was called for, go still when stillness was required. Trust for Suo Yang was not a feeling. It was a ledger, and Min-jae's account had never once come up short. His fingers closed around the stem. A small hand shot out of nowhere and knocked it sideways. The glass hit the marble floor and exploded into 100 red-stained pieces, and for one full second the entire restaurant simply stopped, forks halfway to mouths, the quartet's bow frozen mid-stroke. Then every head in the room turned toward the sound. An 8-year-old girl stood at Suo Yang's elbow, chest rising and falling too fast, both hands still out in front of her like she expected the glass to reassemble itself and come at her. Two men in dark suits were moving before Suo Yang lifted a finger, closing in on either side of the girl the way water closes around a stone. He raised 2 fingers off the table, barely, and they stopped. He looked at her. Really looked the way he looked at contracts before he signed them. Who is this girl? Nobody answered. A waitress near the kitchen doors had gone the color of the tablecloths, one hand pressed flat against her own chest. The girl did not look away from him. Her chin was still trembling, but her eyes had found his and were staying there, which was more than most adults managed.
Don't drink anything he gives you.
Something crossed Min-jae's face and was gone before it could be named, but Suo Yang caught the edge of it, the way you catch the flicker of a candle in a dark room even after someone's blown it out. Why? He asked the girl, and his voice had dropped into the register his men called the quiet one, the one that scared them more than shouting ever did. She glanced once at Min-jae, then back, and when she spoke her voice had gone very small, like she was letting him in on something she wasn't supposed to know. Because I saw him put something inside. If you want to know what happens after that broken glass, stick with me because this story does not slow down from here. Comment below and tell me, if you were Suo Yang, would you have believed her? The story you're watching begins hours earlier, before the wine, before the girl, before any of it. Juliana had been on her feet since noon. The restaurant ran her ragged on double shifts, plates stacked up her arm like some circus trick she'd never auditioned for, and she still managed to smile at every table because a smile cost nothing and tips depended on it. She was 31 years old with her mother's cheekbones and her father's stubborn jaw, a woman built out of quiet effort, the kind nobody claps for. A man in a suit that probably cost more than her rent snapped his fingers at her from table 9. She turned too fast, caught the edge of his water glass, and sent a thin sheet of it across his sleeve. "Are you serious?" he said, not even bothering to raise his voice, which was somehow worse. "Do you people not train your staff?" Juliana apologized 3 times before he stopped talking, grabbing napkins, dabbing at a sleeve that wasn't even that wet, feeling the whole dining room's attention settle on her like a weight she'd have to carry the rest of the shift. Across the restaurant, Suo Yang watched without appearing to watch, which was a skill he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. He didn't stand. He didn't intervene. He simply waited until the manager passed close to his table, and said 4 words without looking up from his glass. "She's not to be punished." The manager didn't ask why. Nobody asked Suo Yang why. Juliana never knew. She finished her shift believing she'd nearly lost her job over spilled water, carrying that small humiliation home with her like she carried most things, quietly without complaint, filed away where it wouldn't slow her down tomorrow. Outside, after her shift ended, Ajana was waiting on the bench where she always waited, swinging her legs, a library book open on her lap that she wasn't really reading. She was small for 8, with her mother's watchfulness and something else that belonged only to her, a way of looking at a room like she was cataloging it. She noticed Suo Yang before he noticed her. He was sitting alone at an outdoor table, untouched coffee in front of him, jacket still buttoned despite the heat, A man built entirely out of straight lines even when he was doing nothing at all. Every adult who walked past gave him a wide, unconscious berth, the way people step around a hole in the sidewalk without quite registering why. Ajana walked straight up to him and held out half a peanut butter sandwich. "You look sad." He blinked at her like she'd spoken in a language he half remembered from childhood. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine. You look like the man on the cereal box my mom won't buy anymore. The one with the sad eyes." He almost smiled. He caught it before it fully arrived. "I don't want your sandwich." She shrugged, already pulling it back, already unbothered. "Okay. More for me." She sat on the low wall a few feet from him, swinging her legs again, and ate her half of the sandwich in small, deliberate bites, and did not look at him again, and somehow that not looking was the loudest thing that had happened to Suo Yang in years. Nobody in his world ignored him. Being ignored, he realized, felt almost like being touched. For the first time in longer than he could easily count, something in his face moved that wasn't a calculation. If a story like this is speaking to you already, make sure you're subscribed because what's coming will wreck you in the best way. 3 blocks from the restaurant, in an office with the blinds always drawn to exactly the same angle, a woman named Priya Akoncorez reviewed a stack of shipping manifests that didn't quite add up. She had worked for Suo Yang's organization for 6 years, first as a translator, then as something closer to an accountant, and in all that time nobody had ever once suspected that a small piece of what she reported went somewhere it shouldn't. She wasn't proud of it. She told herself that most nights, lying awake beside a husband who believed she worked in logistics and nothing more. Her brother had gotten himself into a debt that belonged to men far less patient than Suo Yang, and when Kang Daeho's people had found her, quietly the way they found everyone, the offer had come wrapped in a kindness that felt, at the time, like rescue. All she had to do, they said, was watch. Note who came and went. Flag anything unusual. Nothing that would hurt anyone. She believed that too for a while. Priya didn't know Daeho's face. She had never met him. Her contact was a courier who called himself Mr. Song, a soft-spoken man who collected her reports over coffee he never finished and left tips too large for the diner they met in, as if the excess might buy back some of what he was taking. It was Priya who had first mentioned months earlier that a waitress named Juliana had caught Suo Yang's attention. It was a small detail in a much larger report, 3 sentences buried between a note about a delayed container and a scheduling change nobody would remember by Friday. She had no way of knowing what those 3 sentences would set in motion. That is the particular cruelty of a ledger. Every entry looks small until someone adds it up. Weeks folded into each other. Suo Yang found reasons to be at the restaurant more often than his schedule strictly required, and if his men noticed, none of them were foolish enough to say so out loud. He watched Ajana the way a man watches whether he doesn't trust yet, half convinced it will turn on him. She never performed for him. She argued with him about which animal was smartest, an octopus, obviously, and told him bluntly that his tie was ugly and once, without any warning at all, climbed onto the chair beside his and simply sat there doing her homework while he took a phone call about a shipment that, had she understood a word of it, would have terrified her. Juliana noticed the pattern before she understood it. "Stay away from that man," she told her daughter one evening, braiding Ajana's hair with hands that had gone stiff with the effort of sounding calm. "What? He doesn't look scary to me." Juliana's hands paused on the braid. She didn't have an answer that a child could carry without breaking under its weight, so she said nothing, and the silence sat between them the rest of the night. She had reasons Ajana didn't know about. Reasons that went back further than either of them had lived. Minjae, meanwhile, had begun asking questions of his own, quietly, the way he did everything. A waitress named Juliana. Single mother. No known ties to anyone in their world. Ordinary, on paper, which was exactly the kind of ordinary that made Minjae suspicious, because in his experience nothing that mattered ever looked like what it was. He pulled her file the way he pulled every file, out of habit more than intention, and what he found made him sit very still in his office long after everyone else had gone home. Her father's name. He knew that name. Everyone in the organization over 40 knew that name, spoken in the same breath as betrayal, the man blamed for handing Suo Yang's father to his enemies 20 years ago. The man who vanished the same week Suo Yang's father was buried. Minjae read the file twice, and somewhere in the second reading, an idea began to take a shape he didn't yet let himself look at directly. If Juliana was the daughter of the man who destroyed everything, then her daughter, without knowing it, might be sitting on something worth more than either of them understood. Comment right now, do you think Juliana knows what her father really did? Keep that question in your pocket. You're going to need it. If you've made it this far, you're about 5 minutes into tonight's story. This is exactly the moment I ask you to hit subscribe if you haven't already, because the next stretch is where everything starts unraveling, and I don't want you to lose the thread halfway through. There's a lot more still coming. 2 states away, in a coastal town small enough that everyone still knew whose car belonged in whose driveway, an old man named Tomas Reyes kept a shop that sold nothing anyone particularly needed. Restaurant fishing reels, second-hand radios, the occasional antique clock he never quite finished repairing. He had lived under that name for 18 years and before that, under a different one entirely. Tomas Reyes had once worked security for Suo Yang's father. He had been nearby 20 years ago, when a man everyone called a traitor tried, badly and too late, to warn his employer that the danger wasn't coming from outside the family at all. Reyes had believed him. He had also been the one to quietly disappear afterward, when it became clear that believing the wrong thing out loud could cost a man everything. A new name, a new town, a silence he kept for 2 decades. He still had the ledger page. A single sheet, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, listing a name he'd never said out loud since the funeral. He kept it taped inside the false bottom of a cigar box he never smoked from, and some nights when the shop was closed and the street outside had gone quiet, he took it out and looked at it and put it back the way other men might visit a grave. He didn't know that a courier calling himself Mr. Song had, 6 weeks earlier, begun asking quiet questions in 3 different towns about a security man who'd vanished after a funeral 2 decades ago. He didn't know that Kong Daeho had spent years making sure every loose thread from that night eventually got found and dealt with. He was about to find out. Mireille Castell covered the kind of stories most of her editors considered too dangerous to run. Labor abuses, shell companies, the slow rot underneath cities that looked polished from a distance. She had been circling Suo Yang's organization for the better part of a year, not because she believed he was worse than his rivals, but because his ledgers were cleaner than anyone's had a right to be, and clean ledgers, in her experience, usually meant someone extremely good at hiding the mess underneath. It was Mireille who first noticed the pattern in Kong Daeho's shell investments. Restaurant leases, catering contracts, small unglamorous businesses that kept threading their way, always at one remove, back toward Suo Yang's world. She didn't yet know what it meant. She only knew it was strange, and strange to a reporter like her, was the same thing as a door left slightly open. She had never met Suo Yang. She had, twice, exchanged emails with a man who signed himself only as Mr. Song, offering her documents about a rival organization that always seemed to arrive exactly when they do the most damage to someone Daeho wanted damaged. She hadn't used any of it yet. Something about how easily it came made her trust it less, not more. She kept a file of her own, growing quietly on a laptop she never connected to any network she didn't control herself. She didn't know it yet, but that file would end up mattering more than anyone in this story, Suo Yang included, could have predicted. It was around this time that the weeks that followed changed something between Suo Yang and the small family that didn't want anything from him. He paid Ajana's school fees without telling anyone, routed through an account that couldn't be traced back to him by anyone less thorough than Minjae, and when Juliana discovered it, 3 months in from a confused phone call with the school office, she marched into the restaurant on her day off with her jaw set the way it got right before she said something she couldn't take back. "I don't want your money." He didn't look up from the papers in front of him immediately, which somehow made her angrier. It wasn't charity. Then what was it? He set the pen down. For a long moment he looked at her the way he'd once looked at her daughter, like he was recalculating something. "Consider it repayment," he said, "for raising the bravest person I've ever met." Juliana didn't have an answer for that. She stood there with her arms crossed and her anger draining out of her before she was ready to let it go, and something in the space between them shifted the way weather shifts, not with a single event but with 100 small pressures nobody notices until the sky is a different color. It was around this time that Juliana learned who he really was. Not from him. From a coworker who laughed nervously and asked if she'd lost her mind, getting close to a man like that, didn't she know what he did, what he was? Juliana went home that night and sat on the edge of Ajana's bed long after her daughter had fallen asleep, replaying every kind thing he'd done and turning it over, looking for the trap she was sure had to be hidden somewhere inside it. She gave her notice the following week. Suo Yang let her go without a fight, which surprised her more than any argument would have. But before she walked out the door for the last time, he stopped her. "I won't ask you to love me," he said, and his voice had none of the ice it carried with everyone else. "But please don't teach your daughter to hate me for things she doesn't understand." Juliana left without answering. She told herself it was the right thing. She told herself that for a long time. If you've ever loved someone you were sure you shouldn't, you already know exactly where this story is about to go. Type, "I know that feeling" below if this one's hitting close to home. While Suo Yang was learning how to want something he couldn't buy, Min-jae was meeting a man in a private room 3 floors above a jazz club that didn't officially exist. Kang Dae-ho poured 2 glasses of something aged longer than Min-jae had been alive and did not sit across from him so much as arrange himself, every motion economical, every word chosen the way a jeweler chooses which stone goes where. "You still think about it?" Dae-ho said. It wasn't a question. Min-jae's jaw worked once before he answered. "Every day." His father built an empire on the backs of people he called family. Your family included. "I know what he did." "Then you know what justice looks like." Min-jae had believed for 11 years that Suo Yang's father had been responsible for the deaths in his own family, a fire that had never quite made sense, an investigation that closed too fast and too cleanly. He had built his entire adult life around a friendship with the son of the man he blamed, patient as stone, waiting for the day the debt could finally be collected. Dae-ho had found him at exactly the moment that patience had started to curdle into something else, and had spent 2 years feeding it carefully, a fact here, a rumor there, each one calibrated to keep the fire fed without ever showing Min-jae the hand doing the feeding. "The dinner," Dae-ho said. "It has to look like his enemies. Not us. Never us." Min-jae stared into his glass. Somewhere underneath the certainty he'd built his whole plan on, something small and unexamined was beginning quietly to doubt. He didn't listen to it. Not yet. What Min-jae did not know, what even Dae-ho only half suspected, was that the man he answered to was in turn answering to someone else. Dae-ho had spent years believing himself the architect of Suo Yang's ruin. In truth, he was closer to a very expensive, very loyal tool, sharpened by a hand he had never once thought to look for. We're about halfway through tonight's story and I promise you, it only gets heavier from here. If this is your first time on the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss where this goes. And if you're the kind of person who likes finishing a story the night you started instead of waiting for the next upload, stick around to the end, I'll tell you where you can do exactly that. Mr. Song found Tomas Reyes on a Thursday, standing behind the counter of his shop with a clock disassembled in front of him, its gears laid out in a neat row like something waiting for surgery. He didn't announce himself as anything other than a customer at first. He bought a second-hand radio he didn't need and asked, almost idly, whether the old man had ever worked security back east years ago, before he'd settled into fixing clocks. Reyes's hands went very still over the gears. "You've got the wrong man." "Maybe," Mr. Song said and set a card on the counter, blank except for a phone number. "If I do, no harm done. If I don't, someone would like to know you're still alive. That's all. Nothing more than that." He left without waiting for an answer. Reyes did not call the number. He also did not sleep that night, and by morning he had packed the cigar box, the false bottom, the single folded ledger page into a bag he hadn't used in 18 years, and driven 3 towns over to mail a copy of everything to the one name he still remembered from his old life who might actually do something honest with it. A young reporter named Mireille Castel, whose byline he'd been quietly following for 2 years without ever working up the courage to write to her directly. He did not know that Mr. Song had photographed his license plate before he ever set foot in the shop. The night of the dinner arrived dressed as an ordinary Tuesday. Juliana was back at the restaurant by then, not as a waitress but managing the front of house for one of Suo Yang's smaller, cleaner ventures 2 streets over, a job she'd taken with her chin up and her guard even higher, telling herself it changed nothing between them. Ajana had come along after school, tucked into a booth near the kitchen with her homework, close enough to hear the clatter of dishes and far enough to be forgotten by the room. She wasn't forgotten by everything in it. Min-jae stood near the private dining room, glass in one hand, something small and folded in the other. He worked with the unhurried confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head so many times that his hands no longer needed his attention. He tipped the folded paper's contents into the wine and stirred it with the same spoon he'd used to stir sugar into coffee. Ajana looked up at the wrong moment or the right one depending on which version of the story you believe in. She didn't understand what she'd seen. Not really. But her mother's voice arrived in her head anyway, unbidden, something Juliana had told her 100 times without ever explaining why she felt the need to. Never eat or drink anything you didn't see prepared. Suo Yang lifted the glass. Ajana was moving before she decided to move, chair scraping back, small feet slapping across marble, one word tearing out of her loud enough to turn every head in the room. Stop. The glass hit the floor. The room went silent the way rooms only go silent right before something true gets said. A doctor among the guests, there for an entirely different dinner at an entirely different table, was summoned to test what remained of the shattered glass, more out of caution than suspicion. His face, when he looked up from the small sample, told the room everything before he spoke a word of it. Poison. Suo Yang turned his eyes on Min-jae. For the first time in 11 years, something that might have been fear moved behind his oldest friend's expression, and for the first time in longer than that, Suo Yang let himself feel the shape of what betrayal actually costs. You didn't think it would stop there, did you? Comment below if you saw this coming and stick around because the next twist is the one that made me rewrite this whole story twice. Min-jae recovered his composure faster than anyone in the room, which was, in hindsight, the first sign of how far he'd already fallen. He turned, pointed a steady hand at Juliana standing frozen by the kitchen doors, and said the thing he'd already decided he would say hours before he ever poured the wine. She used the girl. It's the mother. She's been planning this since the day she came back. The accusation moved through the room faster than the poison would have. Juliana barely had time to open her mouth before two of Suo Yang's men had her by the arms, and Ajana was crying her mother's name into a room full of people who had already decided, on the strength of one confident sentence, that they knew exactly what had happened here. Juliana was taken into custody before midnight. The detective assigned to the case, a sharp, unhurried woman named Rosa Alvarez, took one look at the crime scene report and felt the particular itch she'd learned over 15 years never to ignore. The itch that came from a story that fit together too neatly, every piece cut to match every other piece before anyone had bothered to actually measure them. She processed the case because the evidence in front of her demanded it. She did not, privately, believe a word of it. Ajana cried into Suo Yang's jacket in the back of a car she didn't remember climbing into, small fists twisted into the fabric, repeating the same 4 words like they were the only ones she had left. My mommy didn't do it. Suo Yang held very still, the way he'd learned to hold still around things that might break if he moved wrong, and stared out the window at a city he suddenly wasn't sure he understood anymore. Something about Min-jae's certainty had bothered him from the first second. Min-jae was many things, but he had never once, in 11 years, spoken with that particular confidence about anything he hadn't already rehearsed. And there was a simpler problem underneath that one, sharper, harder to ignore the longer he sat with it. Only a handful of people had known about tonight's dinner. Himself, Min-jae. 3 men whose loyalty had never once been questioned. Someone inside his own house had made the poison possible. Juliana hadn't been in the room when the details were arranged. She couldn't have been. Someone wanted him to believe otherwise, badly enough to hand him a convenient villain wrapped in a bow. If you're starting to suspect the wrong person got arrested tonight, you're paying closer attention than half the room in that restaurant. Keep watching. This is where the story really opens up. Rosa Alvarez sat across an interrogation table from Juliana at 2 in the morning, a cup of vending machine coffee going cold between them, and asked the same question 3 different ways before she finally set her pen down. Walk me through the last time you were alone in that kitchen before service. I wasn't. There's always someone else back there. So no window where you could have handled a wine bottle unsupervised. None. Alvarez already knew that. She checked the schedule twice. What she hadn't yet said out loud to anyone was that the timeline the other witnesses had given, the one Min-jae's accusation depended on, put Juliana on the wrong side of the building entirely during the 15 minutes the poison would have needed to be introduced. She looked at the case file in front of her, thick with statements that all seemed to agree with each other a little too easily, and felt that itch again. Off the record, she said quietly, who benefits if you go down for this? Juliana didn't have an answer. But somewhere 3 floors above a jazz club that didn't officially exist, a man with a very good answer was already congratulating himself on a job well done. While the city slept, Suo Yang's uncle sat in his study with a glass of the same wine that had nearly killed his nephew, and did not drink it either, out of habit more than caution. He had learned patience from a brother he had eventually killed, which he considered, privately, a kind of poetry. He had built his patience over 20 years, smiling at family dinners, holding Suo Yang as a baby, standing at his brother's funeral with tears everyone assumed were real. He had never wanted his nephew dead out of hatred. That would have been easier to live with. He wanted him dead out of arithmetic, a simple calculation about who stood between himself and everything his brother had built. Daeho had been useful for exactly that reason. A man with his own grudge, willing to do the work and take none of the credit. Min-jae had been useful too, a wound the uncle had found and kept carefully open for years, feeding it just enough to keep it from healing. Now there was Priya feeding information from inside the house. There was Mr. Song, cleaning up loose threads before they could tie back to anyone who mattered. There was soon going to be a fisherman named Tomas Reyes, whose continued existence was becoming a problem the uncle intended to solve before the week was out. What the uncle had not accounted for was a reporter named Mireille Castel, who at that exact moment was standing in her kitchen at 3 a.m, reading a handwritten letter that had arrived by courier that afternoon, and a folded ledger page that named, in careful faded handwriting, exactly who had ordered a fire 20 years ago that everyone had since blamed on the wrong man entirely. Suo Yang did not sleep that night. He sat in his office with Juliana's file open in front of him, the same file Min-jae had once read with an idea taking shape behind his eyes, and worked backward through 20 years of a story he'd been told so many times he'd stopped questioning whether it was true. Her father's name had been a curse word in his household since before he could walk. The man who betrayed the family. The man who handed his father to the people who killed him. Suo Yang had grown up carrying that hatred the way children carry the shapes of rooms they were raised in, without ever once measuring the walls. He measured them now. What he found, buried under 2 decades of assumption, was a man who had died trying to warn Suo Yang's father, not trying to destroy him. A man who had discovered weeks before the assassination exactly who was orchestrating it, and who had been silenced before he could say the name out loud to anyone who might have believed him. The name, when Suo Yang finally uncovered it in a set of records someone had worked very hard to bury, was Kang Daeho. Juliana's father hadn't betrayed anyone. He had died protecting a family that had spent 20 years hating his memory for it. Suo Yang sat with that for a long time before he trusted himself to move. He went to Min-jae first, because some part of him still needed to hear it from the mouth of the man who'd worn his friendship like a mask for over a decade. Min-jae didn't deny it. Something in him seemed almost relieved to stop pretending, the confession coming out of him in pieces, each one heavier than the last. The years of quiet belief that Suo Yang's father had murdered his own family. The patience Daeho had spent cultivating that belief into something sharp enough to use. The poison, engineered to look like an outside enemy's work, never their own. Then Min-jae said the thing that turned Suo Yang's blood cold. Daeho isn't the one at the top of this. I only found out recently. There's someone above him. Someone you'd never suspect because you've spent your whole life calling him family. Suo Yang felt the floor of his understanding shift under him a second time in one night. Who? Min-jae's voice dropped low enough that Suo Yang had to lean in to catch it. Your uncle. Somewhere across the city, in a room with the shades drawn, Ajana was already being carried out a back door by 2 men who didn't know they were about to make the worst mistake of their careers. That cliffhanger is not a joke, I promise you that. If you want to know what happens the second this story picks back up, make sure that subscribe button is already pressed, because I don't want you to miss it. Mireille Castel spent the morning after Reyes's letter arrived doing the only thing she knew how to do with information this dangerous. Verifying every word of it before she trusted a syllable. 3 phone calls confirmed the coroner's report from 20 years ago had been amended 11 days after the original filing, in a way that quietly shifted blame from an unnamed party onto a security man who had already vanished. 2 more calls confirmed that the amendment had been requested by a man whose name at the time meant nothing to anyone outside a very small circle. It meant a great deal to her now. She did not yet know Suo Yang. She decided, sitting at her kitchen table with the ledger page spread in front of her, that the ethical thing, and she admitted to herself the safest thing, was not to run the story blind. It was to find the one person in this whole rotten arrangement who had spent 20 years being lied to as thoroughly as Tomas Reyes had been hiding. She sent a message to an assistant she'd once helped out of a legal jam, who happened, conveniently, to work reception at one of Suo Yang's legitimate offices. It reached Suo Yang's desk within the hour, 3 lines long, and signed except for an email address. I have proof your father's death wasn't what you were told. I think you already suspect that. I'd rather hand it to you than print it. But I will print it, with or without you, if the girl who saved your life gets hurt for something she didn't do. Suo Yang read it twice. Then he picked up the phone and, for the first time in his adult life, asked someone outside his organization for help. The warehouse sat on the edge of the industrial district, the kind of building nobody looked at twice, rust creeping up its corrugated sides like something patient and slow. Inside, Ajana sat on an overturned crate with her knees pulled up to her chest, watching two men who clearly didn't know what to do with a child who refused to be afraid of them. She had already worked out 3 things they hadn't noticed her working out. The building had a broken window high on the east wall that let in enough light to tell direction. The men checked their phones every 11 minutes, which meant someone else was watching a clock somewhere. And her bracelet, a cheap plastic thing her mother had bought her at a fair, had a clasp loose enough to slip if she worked at it patiently. She worked at it patiently. Every time one of the men glanced away, she pulled a single bead free and dropped it, marking a trail toward the door in a pattern only someone looking for it would notice. The kidnapping had not, in fact, been part of the uncle's plan. It had been Daeho's improvisation, a way to draw Suo Yang out into the open, somewhere quieter, somewhere the uncle's people could control the outcome without an audience. Daeho had grown impatient watching his careful plan wobble the moment a detective started asking the wrong questions in the wrong tone. Juliana was released within the hour, evidence of her innocence assembled faster than the justice system usually managed when the person assembling it happened to own half the city's judges, and when a detective named Rosa Alvarez had already, quietly, started building the case the other way. She arrived at Suo Yang's office with her hair coming loose from its bun and her eyes raw from crying, and for the first time since the night they'd met, she looked at him and didn't see the danger first. "They took her because they know she matters to me," Suo Yang said, and his voice cracked once on the last word before he caught it. Juliana's hands were shaking. "She matters to me. Then we bring her home." Comment below if you're holding your breath right now, because I promise you so was I writing this. Juliana found the first beat an hour later, in a parking lot 2 blocks from where the ransom call had originated, kneeling in gravel with tears streaking dust down her face, and something in her chest cracked open with a hope so sharp it almost hurt worse than despair had. She followed the trail bead by bead while Suo Yang's people worked the wider search, and when she finally called the police with an address more precise than anything the private search had produced, it was her daughter's stubborn patience that had made the rescue possible, not his money, not his power. Not for the first time and not for the last. Detective Alvarez arrived at the warehouse address within minutes of Juliana's call, having already put patrol units on standby the moment the case had started smelling wrong to her. She had spent the last several hours quietly building a second file, one that traced a name she'd found buried in Kang Daeho's financial records back to a courier who signed his emails only as Mr. Song, and from there to a shipping company that, on paper, had no connection to anyone at all, and in practice, belonged to a man who had never once had his name attached to anything. Suo Yang arrived at the warehouse only minutes ahead of the first patrol car, because some things a man needs to see resolved with his own eyes. His uncle was waiting inside, calm in the particular way of men who believe they've already won, standing near the broken window with his hands folded like he was posing for a family portrait nobody would ever hang. "You should have stayed out of this," his uncle said. "You were always too soft. Your father was the same way. It's why he died believing the wrong people loved him." Suo Yang's voice when it came was very quiet. "Where is she?" His uncle smiled, and in that smile Suo Yang finally saw, clearly, the thing that had been hidden behind every family dinner, every birthday, every hollow embrace for 20 years. He didn't get the chance to say much more. Red and blue light was already sweeping across the corrugated walls, and the 2 guards left to watch the building had no interest in going down for a man who'd never once visited either of them outside of work. It was Min-jae, arriving late and unannounced, who talked one of them down before things could turn ugly. The same 11 years of guilt that had once made him dangerous now spent, quietly and for the first time in years, on doing something right. He stood between Suo Yang and his uncle just long enough for the first officers to reach the door. "I spent years trying to avenge my family," he said, once it was over, each word costing him more than the last, "only to become the monster I hated." Suo Yang held his oldest friend's shoulder and didn't let go, and somewhere behind the sound of his own unsteady breathing, he found the words to forgive a man who probably didn't deserve them, because holding on to the anger any longer would have cost him something he wasn't willing to pay anymore. Ajana was found in the next room, sitting exactly where she'd left the last bead of her bracelet, unafraid, already telling one of the arriving officers precisely how many minutes it had been since the men last checked their phones. The uncle was taken into custody that night, composed to the last, already asking for a lawyer before the car door had shut behind him. It would take months of unraveling shipping records and shell accounts to make anything against him stick in a courtroom, but the shipping company Detective Alvarez had traced, the one with no name attached to anyone, took its first real hit that night, when one of the two guards decided, a few hours later, that loyalty to a man like that wasn't worth what remained of his own future. If you teared up at that scene with Min-jae, you're not alone. I had to stop writing for 10 minutes after that. Let me know in the comments. Was it Min-jae's line that got you or the bracelet? 2 days after the warehouse, Mireille Castel sat across from Suo Yang in a small, unremarkable coffee shop that no one from his world would ever think to look for him in, and slid the folded ledger page across the table. I could have run this a year ago, she said. I didn't because it wasn't finished. It's finished now. Suo Yang read it in silence. When he looked up, something in his face had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a truth so large it needed to be set down carefully or it would break something on the way in. Reyes is alive, he said. It wasn't a question. He was, as of the letter. I haven't been able to reach him since. I'm worried about that. He was worried about that too. He made 2 calls before Mireille had finished her coffee, and the second one confirmed what the first had only hinted at. A man matching Mr. Song's description had been seen near a small shop in a coastal town 3 states away, 2 days earlier, asking about second-hand radios. Rosa Alvarez, working a thread Mireille had passed to her hours earlier through Suo Yang, had already flagged the coastal town to the local police as a location of interest in an active organized crime investigation. Local officers picked Mr. Song up that same afternoon, sitting in a parked car half a block from Reyes's shop, with nothing more dramatic than a quiet knock on the window and a request that he step out slowly. Reyes never even knew until it was already over how close the whole thing had come. What Mr. Song told investigators over the following days did more damage to the uncle's carefully built distance than anything Mireille or Rosa or Suo Yang had managed on their own. He confirmed the shipping company. He confirmed the courier network. He confirmed, with the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who has run out of reasons to protect people who never once protected him, that his instructions had always come down through Kang Dae-ho, and that Dae-ho, in turn, reported to a man he had never met in person but whose signature, a specific old-fashioned flourish, appeared at the bottom of every major decision that mattered. Rosa Alvarez matched that flourish to a single surviving document, a decades-old property transfer, signed the same month Suo Yang's father had died, moving a warehouse district's worth of holdings into a name that had, until that week, seemed entirely unconnected to anything. It was enough. Not for a conviction on its own, that would take months, lawyers, a trial that would drag half the city's polished society through mud they'd spent generations avoiding. But it was enough to freeze accounts, to issue warrants, to turn a man who had spent 20 years believing himself untouchable into a man who suddenly understood, for the first time, what it felt like to be the one being hunted. The truth, once it finally surfaced, came up whole and undeniable, the way truth tends to when enough people have spent enough years trying to keep it buried. Juliana's father had been innocent, a man who died trying to warn a family that would spend 2 decades hating his memory for a crime someone else had committed. Suo Yang's father had been betrayed by the very relative who'd stood weeping at his funeral. Min-jae had been manipulated by a grief he never fully understood into becoming an instrument of the exact kind of betrayal he believed he was avenging. The poisoning had been engineered from the top down by a man who called himself family while planning to bury what remained of it. Juliana had never touched that wine. Ajana, 8 years old and utterly unimpressed by grown men's plans, had saved a man's life twice in the space of a single terrible night. Suo Yang stood in front of cameras he usually avoided and cleared her father's name publicly, every record corrected, every rumor undone with the same careful precision that had once been used to bury the truth in the first place. He returned what had been stolen from her family down to the last document, and when he brought the paperwork to Juliana himself, she pushed it back across the table without looking at it. "I didn't save you," she said. "Ajana did." Something eased in his face, the particular kind of relief that only comes after a long time spent bracing for a blow that never lands. Then I'll spend the rest of my life, he said, making sure she never needs to save another man like me. We're almost at the end now, but stay with me because this ending is the whole reason I wanted to tell you this story in the first place. If it's your first time here, subscribing now means you won't miss whatever I bring you next week. Priya Aconquires turned herself in 11 days after the warehouse, walking into Rosa Alvarez's precinct with a lawyer she'd hired using money she no longer had any interest in keeping. She cooperated fully. Her brother's debt, it turned out, had already been quietly absorbed by Suo Yang months earlier without her knowledge. A small mercy he'd extended without ever telling her, back when she was still only a name in a file he hadn't yet had reason to distrust. When she learned that, she cried harder than she had at her own arrest. Kang Dae-ho was arrested at the jazz club 3 floors above the room where he'd once told Min-jae exactly what justice was supposed to look like. He said very little in custody beyond a single request, that whatever happened to him, it happened quickly, because he had spent his whole life being patient and had no interest in spending what remained of it the same way. Mireille Castel ran her story 2 months later, once the legal groundwork was solid enough that nothing in it could be quietly buried the way the original truth had been. It won her an award she accepted without much interest in the ceremony, more focused on the follow-up piece she was already 3 sources deep into, about a passport office clerk who'd taken an unusually large bribe the same week a wealthy man had suddenly needed to leave the country, because the uncle, facing a trial he could not buy his way out of, had already slipped across a border under a name investigators would spend the better part of a year unraveling. Some debts, Suo Yang reminded himself often in the months that followed, could be delayed by a man with enough money and enough patience. Delayed was not the same thing as forgiven. Tomas Reyes moved back under his real name for the first time in 18 years, reopened a shop 2 blocks from the ocean, and received, every year on the anniversary of a funeral he'd once survived, a single bouquet of flowers with no card attached. He never asked who sent them. He didn't need to. Months passed the way months do after everything true has already been said, quietly, in ordinary increments nobody notices until they add up to something. Suo Yang began stepping back from the world that had built him, piece by piece, trading warehouses for boardrooms and boardrooms for something closer to peace. He started a foundation for children from families like the one his had once nearly destroyed, and if anyone found the irony of that uncomfortable, nobody said so to his face. Juliana kept working because she had never once in her life been the kind of woman comfortable sitting still while someone else paid her bills, and eventually she became the manager of one of his legitimate businesses, a job she'd earned with her own hands and refused to let anyone forget it. Ajana, for her part, adjusted to having a mafia boss turned philanthropist hovering at the edges of her life with the total lack of ceremony only a child can manage. She argued with him about bedtimes. She beat him at cards more often than was statistically likely and never once let him forget it. One evening, over a dinner that had become a habit none of them acknowledged out loud, she looked up from her plate with the same directness that had once knocked a poisoned glass out of his hand. "Are you going to marry Mommy?" Suo Yang choked on his water. Juliana laughed so hard she had to set down her fork, and when she finally looked at him across the table, something passed between them that neither of them had said out loud yet. "Only if she says yes," he managed once he'd recovered enough to speak. Juliana raised an eyebrow, fighting her own smile. "Then you better ask properly." He did, eventually and properly, though that's a story for another night. Comment below if you want to hear how the proposal actually went because I left out one detail tonight on purpose. At the wedding, held in a garden Suo Yang had bought for the occasion and never once mentioned the price of, he gave Ajana a gift that had nothing to do with jewelry or toys. Inside a small wrapped box was a deed. The very first restaurant he had ever purchased, transferred quietly into a trust in her name, waiting for the day she was old enough to run it herself. Juliana stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into something less overwhelming if she looked long enough. "You can't give my daughter an entire restaurant." "She gave me my life," he said simply. "I'm only giving her a future." Ajana threw her arms around him before Juliana could argue further, and then in the small quiet after, she pulled back just far enough to look him in the eye, the same directness she'd carried into every room she'd ever walked into. "So you're my daddy now?" Something in Suo Yang's chest broke open in a way 20 years of hardship never had. He knelt in front of her, in a garden full of people who had spent their lives being wary of him, and let her see exactly how much that question had cost him to hear. "If you'll have me." She hugged him tight enough to leave a mark, and Juliana stood watching them with tears she didn't bother wiping away, because some things are worth letting the whole garden see. Detective Rosa Alvarez, invited more out of gratitude than protocol, stood near the back of the garden with a drink she barely touched, watching a family put itself back together out of pieces she'd spent months helping to find. Mireille Castel sat 2 tables over, already half-drafting in her head the opening line of a book she wouldn't start writing for another year. Tomas Reyes hadn't been able to make the trip, but a single bouquet arrived at the venue that morning anyway, addressed to no one in particular, and everyone who mattered understood exactly who it was from. Years later, a young woman stood outside a restaurant with her name on the door, the same restaurant that had once been paid for by a man who used to be afraid of nothing except being ordinary. A small golden plaque near the entrance read simply, "Founded because one little girl chose kindness when everyone else chose fear." Inside, her parents waited at a corner table that had, by then, been theirs for longer than either of them liked to admit out loud. Ajana turned toward the window, caught sight of them, and knocked once on the glass. "Mom. Dad. Come eat." Suo Yang smiled the smile he'd once believed he'd lost for good, and took Juliana's hand, and they walked inside together, into the restaurant their daughter had built out of nothing but a bracelet, a stubborn instinct, and the simple unshakable refusal to let someone she cared about drink from a glass she hadn't watched being filled. Sometimes the person who saves your life isn't the strongest one in the room. Sometimes it's the smallest. And sometimes one act of kindness doesn't just save a life. It saves an entire family. Never underestimate the power of kindness. The good you do today might be the exact thing that saves you tomorrow. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, do 3 things before you go. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest. And if part of you isn't ready to leave Suo Yang, Juliana, and Ajana behind just yet, there's more of their story waiting for you, a longer, deeper version with scenes I couldn't fit into tonight's video. I'll leave a way to find it in the description for anyone who wants to stay in this world a little longer. Until next time.